Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Michelle Porter. Michelle is an author, poet, and a postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto, where she's pursuing a unique blending of her research and creative output. Her book, due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is called Scratching River. It's a memoir that's part poetry and part nonfiction, but it's all based on family, one's relationships with the landscape and sense of place, and on her Métis ancestry, a First Nations group of mixed European and Indigenous roots. In this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Michelle and I discuss her research background and the process of writing her book, Scratching River. In this second episode, we examine the book's major themes and how it emerged from her current research. So your book, Scratching River, which is coming out in April, that emerged, as you described earlier, out of your current research focus. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this book in particular came together?
It came together from my auntie in British Columbia. I was out visiting her and actually helping her go over a whole bunch of old materials she had in the back of her closet, old recordings of my great-grandfather's music.
Mm-hmm.
And she told me I needed to get a copy of, I had not read it, she told me I needed to get a copy of Louis Goulet's Vanishing Spaces. Now, Louis Goulet is a Goulet ancestor who was living through the sort of post resistance years in the late 1800s, and a couple of researchers transcribed and recorded his oral history memoirs about growing up with the buffalo hunt and the Red River cart, traveling around the Métis homeland, and some of the changes that happened during those years.
Mm-hmm.
I ordered a copy. I got it in my hands, and I knew that I wanted to write something in conversation with his memoir, sort of the way some First Nations musicians have created music in conversation with old recordings of music.
Mm-hmm.
That was my basic idea. Because of my academic background, I wanted to include in that historical research, but also research about the land that both he was living on and the way the land is today, and to see what kind of conversation that would create.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, there's parts of that book in Scratching River, but the central focus for the book shifted significantly as I sat down to write it.
Right. And that shift was into your immediate family, correct? I mean, that your brother and your mother. Yep.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, you didn't set out to write that, right?
I didn't set out to write about my brother at all.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have my brother on my mind at all. There was something about Louis Goulet's descriptions of traveling across the prairies that resonated with me, that made me remember. And it was kind of a physical memory too. So he described traveling on the cart, traveling on the prairies, and he was very evocative, a very good storyteller. And I started to just have these physical memories of being in the back of a car as we're traveling to see my older brother. Now, my older brother didn't live with us from the time that he was 9. He lived at a home for autistic children in Calgary, Alberta. And wherever we lived, and we moved around a lot, we were always on the road to see him,
Mm-hmm.
visit him. And the traveling, it was this shared family history of traveling. Now, the reasons and in many ways the motivations are very different, but this feeling of just always being on the road, traveling to something related to family, had such a resonance and such a parallel to me that I decided to explore it. Now,
Hmm.
it was almost like during this time, during the time that I was doing the writing, my 14-year-old self, this 14-year-old girl came and sat down beside me and said, "I have a story to tell." And I decided to tell that story with her and for her. I decided that I needed to tell that story, and it was an important story to tell.
And that 14-year-old girl is you, right?
Yes, that 14, that's right. That the 14-year-old girl, my 14-year-old self sat down beside me and said, "I have to tell you something because I didn't know that there was a 14-year-old girl inside of me who had been deeply traumatized by an
Mm,
incident that had happened to my older brother when I was 14,
mm,
and he had aged out of that child home, and because this all happened together, because this happened in echoing Louis Goulet's story and in remembering our travels, the these stories were just so intertwined. I put them all together
yeah,
in a particular rhythm in a particular way in this book. And we'll talk more about some of those details, I think.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, um, yeah, like you say, that you weave several or many thematic elements in the story, and it's sounding like you didn't really set out to incorporate these. Obviously, they kind of emerged as you got further into it, and I'm thinking of your Métis ancestry, rivers, family relationships. I'm wondering if you can kind of
yeah.
describe
So
that. Yeah.
the family relationships were part of when I came to my brother. When I came, so this is a very organic process, clearly, that I follow when
Yes.
I'm writing. I follow
Right.
I follow my gut
Yes. Yeah.
in a very, very strong way. So the family relationships were very much a part of how I thought I could tell the story. um, the river came about later, so I'm telling the story about how rivers parallel our river processes, geomorphology, river morphology, how they how much we can learn from rivers about how to deal with barriers, with
Mm,
drying up, with trauma. And that began as I was doing research about the rivers Louis Goulet lived along and traveled to as a child. So it was again this process of research and of setting out not just to write, but to begin with that research is how this book came together and how most of my writing in the last 5 years has come together. This research as core.
right. Excellent. So that we've talked a little bit about your brother, who is one of the elements at the core, at the center of the book. And as you've related in an earlier conversation, your brother wasn't necessarily able to speak for himself as you put this book together. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about your brother and how, but really how you were able to tell his story and maybe some of the challenges in sort of maintaining his agency throughout the story?
For sure. Yeah.
Hmm.
My brother was born in 1970, and he a few years later showed such significant signs of developmental delay and developmental confusion as well, that my mother took him to a series of doctors. Now, anybody who knows, anybody who's involved in the community of the autistic community and or mental illness community knows that back then there weren't a lot of resources at all
Mm,
for parents.
right.
Eventually, my brother would get the dual diagnoses of autism and schizophrenia, but for many, many years they really just didn't know what was going on. And actually, my mother was on the receiving end of accusations that she was doing something wrong,
Oh,
as many mothers were really at the time, and that if she would parent him right, he would be okay. Now he's he doesn't speak. He had learned throughout the years very limited sign language,
mhm,
and he doesn't respond. The doctors have always said he's probably at about the stayed at about the level of a 2 or 3 year old in many ways. Now, I never saw him that way. I saw him as this big, free, wild man who captured my imagination because he didn't care one whit what anybody else thought or wanted him to do. And I always, perhaps a shy child, I always found that so beautiful. And we always had a very strong bond. So when my brother was in the childhood home in Calgary, we would often go see him, and we would, play with him, play in his playroom. It was built this beautiful relationship with him. When he turned 18, he couldn't live in this home anymore, and my mother, like so many parents still today, struggled with finding an adult home for him.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not a lot of support. There's not a lot of assurances that they're going to be treated very well in so many ways. She found what she thought was a beautiful home on a ranch in rural Alberta. And within 3 months of being in that home, he he was hospitalized with third-degree burns all the way up both of his legs, and injuries all over his body. And of course, the story tells about how my mother found out about this, because she wasn't notified by the place he was staying at. So this was such a deep shock to us, the whole family, and to myself as a 14-year-old, when my mother said, "Michelle, I'd like you to come with me and help me care for him in the hospital." We were living in St. Albert at the time. I said, "Yes, I'm going. I'm going to go help take care of my brother." Now, I was 14, and when I walked in that room and saw my brother, I saw the evil that can happen in the world, and
Mm-hmm.
that impacted me so deeply that there's a part of me that always stayed there. Now,
Right.
for my brother, he recovered in that hospital. He went back home to his childhood school. They took him back. They loved him, and
Oh,
he
good.
returned to himself, and he moved on. And in a very significant way, I never did. But in the process of writing this, it unlocked quite a bit of that sort of trauma blocking that
Mm-hmm.
can happen. So that's kind of where I was coming from at it.
Yeah.
But when you're telling a story about a trauma, a deep trauma and a deep abuse of somebody else, the danger is, appropriating voice and speaking for them, speaking over them. Um, I didn't want to do that with my brother because my relationship, a good part is just because he's my big brother. You
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
a little sister doesn't think about, you don't think about taking over your big brother's voice. You just don't do that. So, um, but I also didn't want, I'd known that there are other writers who approach this in different ways. And there'd been another writer that was pointed out to me who was also dealing with a brother with mental illness, but who wrote about it by imagining what this brother might be having to say. And I decided not to go that route. I
Mm-hmm.
created a book that was in conversation with all of the people who love him and whom he loved growing up and beyond and as an adult. So that's been a gift to me, and that's been his gift to me, to realize a big part of unlocking that trauma for me and that healing was that realization that that my brother is speaking to me through all that love he's able to evoke in people around him, because he's this free-spirited, silly person, and he always does that. And so I went with that storytelling, having the voices around him tell the story, as well as sort of telling a bit of a folk tale portion that more symbolically tells a story of our relationship.
Yeah. I love that description, because you, just because you can't speak or even sign, I mean, there's so many other ways to communicate, obviously, and important people in your brother's life, and they kind of interpret in their own way how your brother communicates to them. And I imagine that must have been amazing to be able to talk to those folks and sort of learn from them what they took away from your brother, and what they learned from your brother, and how he related to them.
So much so, like, there was a part of me after I was 14. I probably trauma can be a funny thing because I don't recall a whole lot talking to these people after leaving that hospital. And as that 14-year-old, my brother was still in that hospital. And I think he remained in that hospital sort of in my mind, in that 14-year-old for all of these years until I sat down to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
And in essence, with that 14-year-old me sitting beside me, I showed her, my brother showed us through the voices of the people that loved him that he moved on and he healed and he was okay. And I didn't know that, but there was a part of me that did.
Right. That's wonderful. You just heard from Michelle Porter, an author, poet, and postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto. Michelle's first book of poetry, Inquiries, was shortlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award in 2019 and was a finalist for the E.J. Pratt Poetry Award in 2021. Her memoir, Scratching River, is due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week as we look more closely at Michelle's writing style, including the way she blended primary source research, her family's perspectives, and her own narrative voice.
Everything in this book is, held up, substantiated. Its foundation is research or interview that I have done with somebody. Every part that I wrote, because there's the newspaper excerpts in there, and the process of moving parts of it into my voice, which is, I followed very much poetic. If you some of the style here, if you read my book of poetry Inquiries, you would even recognize even the way some of the sections start very direct, giving that person their voice right away. But that's also my voice, which is listening to other people and putting that onto the page.
As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.